Once upon a time, I referred to World of Warcraft as the greatest social network to ever exist. Which really isn't all that far-fetched, considering that WoW is the largest and most notable MMORPG out there. Again, WoW is an MMORPG, and I feel that the first half of that initialism is the most important part, because there are plenty of RPGs that exist in the video game space. But the MMO, which stands for Massively Multiplayer Online, would indicate that World of Warcraft was designed to be a social game. WoW was a massive world with a massive number of players in it, and that led to massive appeal. And that's not to take away from the RPG aspect, because that was also very important. You see, WoW was a fantasy world, and you were playing a role in that world. But it was the millions of other people that were there with you, the people that you would interact with, the people that you would team up with, build friendships with, and cooperate with, that turned that world into a living one. By design, World of Warcraft was a social game, a social RPG. I would even go as far to say that at one time, socializing was as much a part of the game as completing a quest or killing a raid boss. Blizzard seems to have lost sight of this, and over time, socializing became less and less necessary. The result being the social fabric of the game almost completely evaporating. And I believe that this reaches further than many realize, affecting even the most antisocial of WoW players. To help you fully understand why I feel this way, I would like to recall some key experiences that I've had during my time with this game. Now, these experiences are completely unique to me, and my thoughts on them are entirely my own. They do not reflect on the thoughts and feelings of anyone else. So I started playing WoW right around the time that Burning Crusade came out, and I did not know anything about that because I knew very little about the game. I started playing it because I watched that South Park episode and I discovered that WoW was something different from the RTS games that had come before it. Now, I had no friends to play this game with. I didn't know a single person that had even the slightest interest in World of Warcraft, so I was exploring this new frontier all on my own. But I was immediately hooked on WoW. I mean, you had this amazing world with this wondrous sense of progression. And what really set that over the edge was that there were so many other people in this world. I remember being in awe the first time I entered Goldshire, seeing so many people running around, and seeing high-level characters with their epic gear, dueling each other outside of Stormwind. I can recount so many times being in a sticky situation on the brink of death as another player stepped in to save me from a long graveyard run. And the numerous times that I would group up with other people on my server to work together to complete a really difficult quest, and then coming across those same people later on in my adventures. WoW truly did feel like another world, and what made it that way was that there were other people living out their adventures. And then the time came when I wanted to explore dungeons, and I quickly realized the tedium of having to try to find a group. But sooner or later I would manage to get into a group and we would run some dungeons. One night I was running Blackrock Depths with a group, and I remember it vividly because I was playing my Night Elf Hunter and the tank was a Draenei Paladin named Tease. Now, of course, I was still a pretty big noob at the time, and I've always had a sense of nervousness whenever I do group content or run dungeons with people due to my vision, because I'm always afraid that I'm going to miss something or not see something, and it's going to result in me being responsible for wiping the group, and then everyone's going to hate me. You get it. But this group was particularly cool. The tank, Tease, asked me to crowd control the X. Back then you had to crowd control things, and I had no idea what he was talking about. So embarrassed, I had to explain this to him, and he was cool about it. He was like, "It's not a big deal, man. Here, I'll show you how to do it." And right there in that dungeon, he showed me how to use Frost Trap and how to kite and how to CC things. Of course, it took me a few tries to get it down perfectly, but by the end of that dungeon, I knew how to CC, and the group was really cool about it, and they were really patient with me, and everything worked out just fine. In fact, those guys were so cool that they told me that I should add them as friends and that we would run dungeons again sometime. So every couple nights I would group up and run dungeons with those guys. And that's when I realized something very important. There was a social aspect to this game, and if you played it right, you would pretty much never have a problem doing group content. Whenever I found people that I enjoyed grouping up with, I would add them as friends, and eventually I had a pretty good sized pool of people that I would be able to run dungeons or do other group content with. Not only did this make it so much easier and quicker to form groups, it also made dungeon running a lot more comfortable because I was running with familiar faces. I found that being social was not only necessary, it was enriching to the core game experience. Eventually, I kind of got tired of playing Alliance and I decided to switch over to Horde, which at that time meant I had to start over on a new server, so I was basically starting from scratch, and I decided to make a Tauren warrior named Caboose. Eventually, I joined up with a guild called Knights of the Old World. It was a pretty casual guild, but there were a lot of active people in it. Guild chat was always active, and it was kind of nice to take a break from the action to have conversations with people that you were slowly becoming more and more familiar with. Eventually, I made friends with a lot of those guys. There were times when I needed help with something and people would come and help me, and vice versa. Whenever they needed help, I would go help them. I vividly remember the Hallows End event that year, running Headless Horseman with those guys. Back then, each individual player had to summon the Headless Horseman, and then you had to kill him, so you'd have to kill him at least 5 times if you were going to do it for everybody in your group. But we did it every single night, and it was so much fun. And soon you start finding yourself bonding with people that you would have never met otherwise, and you start adding them on MySpace, because back then MySpace was still a thing. And, of course, as these things can sometimes happen, the guild eventually dissolved and everyone went their separate ways. But I really valued my time with those guys because it helped show how special the game actually was. Not because of anything in the game, but because the game provided opportunities to meet people. Now, I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but for me, what really made the game special and what gave it longevity was the other players. Unfortunately though, I now found myself without a guild, and this was a big bummer because I had grown accustomed to playing the game with a group of friends every day. So I was desperately looking for a new guild in the hopes that I would make some new friends. Now, at this point in time, I was listening to a Warcraft podcast called The Instance, ran by Scott Johnson, and at the time, his co-host was Randy Jordan, who now works for Blizzard. But at the time, he was the GM for their community guild called Alea Iacta Est, or AIE. During one of their episodes, they were talking about their incredibly large guild and how much they enjoyed being a part of it and how they had such a sense of camaraderie there and how it was such a good place to be and how much it helped them enjoy the game and how nice everyone was. So I figured, hey, I've got nothing to lose, I might as well head on over and join. So I switched over to Earthen Ring US, and that's when TheKephas was born. And in a few weeks, I joined Alea Iacta Est. From that day forward, I never looked back. From the day I joined AIE, I felt extremely welcomed. Guild chat was very active, and I immediately jumped right in. Now this is back when guilds didn't have a member cap, so when I say that AIE was huge, I mean it was so huge that it actually broke the guild interface, because you couldn't actually see how many people were online. So I was meeting all kinds of different people and doing tons of random things with them in the game. On top of that, the officers had created a mod called Call to Arms, and the way this mod works is it would use chat channel that was called LFG, and people could form groups through it. So you could open up the Call to Arms window and you could see in there what groups were being formed for what dungeons and what was needed. So if you were like 3 DPS and you were just looking for a tank or a healer, you could occasionally post in chat what you were looking for and the mod would keep track of your group. This was kind of like Group Finder before Group Finder became a thing, except you still had to group up manually and you still had to meet up together in the game, so there was no fast traveling or teleporting to specific areas. But it made it very easy to group up with members of the guild, and because of that, I was running heroics pretty much every single night with different members of the guild. What was cool about it is that a lot of these groups would encourage you to join the guild's Ventrio server, so we could do voice comm. By the way, remember Ventrio? Anyways, this made it a lot easier to coordinate in the dungeons and also get to know people, and I got to know a lot of cool people. Some I still consider to be good friends to this very day, so much in fact that I even invited them to my wedding. Real friendships that all began just from running dungeons in a video game. I even remember how one of them started. One night I grouped up with some folks and we were running Heroic Utgard Pinnacle. Now, if you remember the dragon boss who breathed like fire on the ground on one side and then on the other side, this was something that I usually had a hard time keeping track of due to my vision. So I asked in voice chat if someone would announce which side the dragon was breathing on, and they had no problem with it. They announced it, I managed to not die, and we got through the boss fight just fine. When I explained that the reason why I needed help was because I had a vision problem and they were taking note of my damage numbers and the fact that I was holding my own in the dungeon, they were pretty surprised, and after that we just got to know each other and they became my friends. I like to think that I'm someone who appreciates kindness from folks because it's something that I have depended on a lot in my life, and when people are kind to me, it's something that I never forget, and I've never forgotten it to this very day. I've never forgotten those guys, and the friendship that came from it is something that I will cherish for the rest of my life, because during this time, I didn't have a lot of friends, and I needed WoW, and I needed those guys to be my friends, and it really helped me in a time of need. And so I owe the game a lot for helping me meet people that were some really great people. So we ran a lot of dungeons back then, and I got to meet more people, and eventually I joined a raid team with those people. I probably played the game more during that time than any other time. I mean, I was logging in every day, hanging out in voice chat every night with people chatting and talking about all kinds of random stuff while playing the game and running dungeons with them, doing raids with them. It was the best of times in World of Warcraft. Then Blizzard implemented the Dungeon Finder, and to be fair, it was a godsend for a lot of people. It would group you up with random people across many different servers and automatically port you in whichever dungeon you're trying to run. This made it so that you no longer had to look for people to run dungeons with, and this fixed a lot of problems. I mean, there were a lot of people who, at best, would spend an hour or more trying to find a group, and at worst, wouldn't get to run a dungeon at all because they couldn't find a group. This eliminated that problem from the game entirely. But whether people want to admit it or not, this did come with a cost, and depending on what you value most in the game, it's going to affect people in different ways, and it affected me in a pretty negative way. In a very short amount of time after Dungeon Finder was released, people in the guild just weren't grouping up together as much, at least not to run dungeons. I mean, why spend any time grouping up with people if you can just click a button and the game will do it for you automatically? It's just a matter of convenience. And don't get me wrong, the guild was still pretty active. People were still talking in guild chat plenty. But Call to Arms really wasn't being used anymore. You didn't see as many groups in Ventrio as you used to. So there wasn't a lot of voice chat going on. There wasn't a lot of running dungeons with people that you knew. You were just queuing up with 4 random people, and at best, you would just run through the dungeon as quickly as possible and never speak to anyone, which completely removed the social aspect from dungeons entirely. I mean, to me, if you're going to run a dungeon with 4 random people and they're never going to speak to you, never coordinate, never interact whatsoever, I may as well be running a dungeon with 4 NPCs. It really doesn't make a difference. But Dungeon Finder came out at the end of Wrath, so people were pretty strong and dungeons were incredibly easy to get through. You just mowed down the trash with AoE and completed the dungeons as quickly as possible. It was pretty easy and there really wasn't a lot of coordination that was required. Then Cataclysm came out. Dungeons were a lot more difficult and suddenly people had to coordinate. This actually sparked a fair deal of outrage in the WoW community. People were upset that dungeons were harder, which was kind of strange because dungeons are always pretty difficult in the beginning of each expansion. Vanilla, BC, Wrath, dungeons were always hard at first. The difference now is that there was a group finder, and when people are grouping up with random other people, they're a little bit less tolerant of each other. There isn't much of a desire to coordinate. People just want to run the dungeons, get through them as quickly as possible, and never speak to each other because it's convenient. You see, when you have to work hard to put together a group, you tend to value those other group members because you work so hard to find them. But when you're randomly pugging with people that you'll probably never see again, those people become a lot more expendable, and you're a lot more impatient with them. Now, I'm not saying that toxicity and impatience didn't exist long before Group Finder, because of course it did. I mean, we all remember Dives, the infamous Onyxia wipe guy.
50 DKP minus!
But these days, the value of an individual group member is minimal, and people just aren't as willing to coordinate. which is a problem because things like CCing and interrupting require coordination. Blizzard had no choice but to cater to this new mindset that was a byproduct of the Dungeon Finder, and this is where the Dungeon Finder has a lot more far-reaching consequences than people realize. When people are less willing to coordinate and are getting frustrated because they're wiping more often now, then you have to take action. So things like crowd control become unnecessary, and then threat gets removed from the game for a while. Those types of mechanics require coordination, and that is an afterthought in the game now. Dungeons became less about how well groups work together and more about your individual performance. If you're a tank, don't pull too many ads. If you're a damage dealer, don't take too much damage and deal out as much as you can. If you're a healer, just keep everyone alive. For the most part, if you follow those simple rules and you are at the appropriate item level, you'll get through most dungeons just fine, and you won't have to speak to anyone. And aside from mythic dungeons and raids, that's pretty much the nature of most group content these days. Even warfronts and island expeditions are designed in such a way to require very little, if any, social interaction between players. And then on top of that, you add things like guild caps, cross-realm zones, and personal loot. It just feels like Blizzard is actively trying to remove as much organic social interaction from the game as possible. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't ever happen or that it can't ever happen. I'm just saying that the game doesn't really require it anymore. And the result is that it doesn't really happen all that much. I mean, I suppose that mythic dungeons and raids do still require a level of cooperation and social interaction, which is nice, but unfortunately, nothing else in the game actually does. Do you remember how I said in the very beginning that when I first started playing this game, I had no friends to play it with? Well, these days, I actually have a number of real-life friends that play the game, and we've never grouped up together or spoken in-game. Anytime we ever talk about the game, it's usually out of the game, which is really kind of weird when you think about it. But I do realize that most of what I'm saying is purely anecdotal. Maybe I'm just the only person in the world who feels like that WoW is less social than it used to be. But when I look back on how things used to be, the game just doesn't feel the same. But maybe I'm just looking through rose-tinted glasses. Maybe J. Allen Brack is right.
Remember when you had to spam cities and say, need a tank, need a tank, need a tank during the Burning Crusade days? You don't remember that because now you just push a button that says go to the dungeon. You don't want to do that.
Dumb cunt.
I also remember when I had friends to play the game with. I remember long nights in Ventrio having awesome conversations with people. I remember when running the same dungeon over and over again didn't get old, and not getting the drop that I wanted wasn't all that big of a deal because I was having fun with my friends. I remember when the World of Warcraft had a spark of genuine human interaction, and it made that world come to life. And I remember that these days, it doesn't seem to have much of that anymore. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and if you'd like, you can support this channel on Patreon. Links to all of this can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.